It's early 1996, and a test audience in Arizona are watching Independence Day, and they're completely loving it. At the back of the cinema is director Roland Emmerich and writer-producer Dean Devlin. On the screen, an epic aerial battle is taking place with the face of the planet in the balance, and then Randy Quaid flies in with a biplane with a missile strapped to it, and the audience laugh. But Roland feels a chill. That is not a good laugh, Roland says. And he's right. Here's how Independence Day nearly crop dusted its ending at the most crucial moment. Independence Day is probably old enough now, 26 at the time of this video, to be considered a classic, which is not to say it's a perfect movie because it definitely isn't, but it is a highly entertaining one that remains iconic and changed the way that blockbusters are made and marketed forever. The images of miles-wide saucers looming over cities and the famous image of the White House exploding captured the imagination of audiences everywhere. Its disaster movie template seems so simple, but Emmerich has spent 2 decades trying and failing, and in the case of Independence Day Resurgence, failing miserably to replicate its success. But it very nearly completely blew it in the home stretch, because if you botch the ending, regardless of anything else in the movie, that will be the first thing on the audience's minds as they step out of the cinema. Let's talk about Independence Day's conclusion. Now, a great many people have brought to task the plot point of Jeff Goldblum's David programming a computer virus into the alien mothership using a Mac laptop, and they're completely right. It is ridiculous, especially if you know anything about computers. But I want to make the argument that it makes thematic sense, especially because Devlin and Emmerich are playfully homaging and updating one of their key inspirations, H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds, and its 1953 film adaptation, where the invaders are defeated by Earth's germs and bacteria. Independence Day serves as a modern remake of that story, 9 years before Steven Spielberg would remake War of the Worlds itself, with a considerably bleaker and more grounded tone than Emmerich and Devlin's Popcorn Fest. Also, in 1996, the average viewer would be considerably less tech literate than they are now, as exemplified by the way that David explains the concept of a computer virus that to the then casual viewer would be, well, alien.
I gave it a cold. I gave it a virus. Computer virus.
Even the way he describes it as a cold makes the War of the Worlds reference very explicit, and yes, it is a flimsy plot point that you can easily make fun of, but to most viewers in 1996, this was not a movie-breaking moment. It's silly, but it's on the right side of silly that audiences will accept. But Randy Quaid flying into an alien battle with his crop dusting plane? That's very much on the wrong side of silly. In the originally filmed ending to Independence Day, Randy Quaid's Russell Case volunteers for the final battle given his prior experience, but is turned down on account of his alcoholism, unlike in the final theatrical release. That he gets turned down when it's a last desperate search for any kind of pilots is a bit implausible, but not entirely unbelievable, especially given the circumstances. This scene in the theatrical release actually cuts away earlier instead of reshooting, so the audience assumes he was selected. So instead of fighting alongside Bill Pullman's President Whitmore, Russell joins the battle late, using his biplane with a stolen missile strapped to the side of it to try and suicidally fly into the alien's laser weapon, much like in the theatrical release, and finally destroy the saucer over Area 51. The idea for this ending is largely credited to Stargate's special effects supervisor Jeffrey A. Okun, the namesake and inspiration for Brett Spiner's Dr. Okun, who insisted they change their originally scripted ending to Russell in the biplane, which probably sounded like a good idea at the time. But when Devlin and Emmerich got the test results back, they realised that Russell in the biplane was something that audiences disliked. And despite the fact the movie had a 93 out of 100 score, they knew they had to revert back to their original ending, even if 20th Century Fox was very reluctant for them to do so, especially given that they were just weeks away from release. They recalled the cast for a single day of shooting in Utah and slapped a wig on Lisa Jacob, who played Russell's daughter Alicia and had shaved her head to play Joan of Arc in the interim, and filmed a bunch of new scenes of Russell being trained, as well as replacing the shots of him in the biplane with shots of him in the cockpit of a fighter jet. But why didn't the originally filmed ending work? To discuss fully, we need to talk about storytelling, specifically character arcs and tone. I do think Independence Day actually gets dismissed for its storytelling because it's a big, loud, full-scale blockbuster, but actually there's a surprisingly subtle subtle elegance to it that is harder than you might think. Devlin and Emmerich have admitted that they took inspiration from 70s disaster movies and is the natural evolution of the kind of films that Irwin Allen made. I think the key difference between earlier disaster movies and later disaster movies is that the new ones put sheer spectacle over characters who just simply move between set pieces. It's the mistake that Emmerich makes in Resurgence, where by trying to top himself, he makes the disaster so cataclysmically huge that it becomes unbelievable, and the characters are completely uninteresting. Yes, the audience remembers the big moments, they remember the White House exploding, but it's characters that keep them invested in the story. In older disaster movies, we're introduced to a set of characters who have to work their way through the destruction to survive, and the conflicts come from that, and we care if they live or die. The characters' individual stories don't have to be complicated, but they do have to have a sense of purpose or progression about them, something that the characters learn or change about themselves that we in the audience also recognise about ourselves and go on that journey with them. When done right, it can be very engaging, satisfying, and even moving. And I would argue that Independence Day does this very well. We tend to think of the movie as belonging to Will Smith, but actually he's barely even in the first half hour, making it a very brief first appearance. Instead, it's a classic ensemble movie, telling seemingly disparate storylines from various perspectives that eventually converge. David meets Whitmore in Washington, Hiller and Russell meet in the Nevada desert, and all the characters eventually meet at Area 51. And all of these characters have their individual conflicts that are set up and paid off. David is an idealist and chess-playing tactician that wants to save the world, that gets to do just that by planning and executing the attack on the opponent's king, the mothership, that allows the pawns, the saucers, to be destroyed. Whitmore is a veteran and former fighter pilot who is considered to be a weak, ineffectual president, whose hesitancy in evacuating the cities costs lives in the initial attack. He eventually manages to find his resolve in leading the remaining humanity together and personally leading the counterattack, becoming a man of action and courage. Hiller wants to be an astronaut, but his NASA application has declined. He gets to live out his wish when he joins David in flying the alien fighter to the mothership. But it's Russell who perhaps has the film's trickiest arc. The film establishes that he was previously abducted by the aliens, where presumably he was tortured and experimented on, but he's treated as some laughable eccentric and his warnings go unheeded. His pain and trauma are not only disbelieved, including by his own family, but cruelly mocked.
Russ, when they took you up in their spaceship, did they do any sexual things to you?
It's a character that draws upon conspiracy theorists and people that have claimed to be abducted by aliens, a type of character that you'll see pop up time and time again in Emmerich's subsequent disaster movies, be it Woody Harrelson's Eccentric in 2012 or John Bradley's Moon Skeptic in Moonfall, all of which are initially dismissed but subsequently proven right. And yes, I am aware that the cuddly conspiracy theorist is an archetype that hasn't particularly aged very well, especially given that Randy Quaid is just playing this type of character in real life now, but I digress. Russell is a character that teeters on the edge of comedy and tragedy, even if he's frequently used for comic relief because he's so dysfunctional, but he does actually care about his family, something that we see more of in the film's extended special edition, which reinstates scenes where he tries to take care of his ill son. But he's also a character that exists on the periphery of the action, often serving as a distant, weary observer to the destruction of the major cities that makes him something of an audience surrogate.
Los Angeles, Washington, and New York have been left in ruins.
Good God!
Russell's character trajectory isn't as obvious as the other characters, and it takes the longest time to resolve. Russell's introduction into the movie establishes him very quickly. As he drunkenly pilots his crop-dusting plane, he's foolhardy and unreliable, as his son chases and ultimately admonishes him for dusting the wrong field, clearly having to be the parent in this relationship. But it's also a setup for the film's conclusion and serves as a bookend for the character. He can fly a plane, and later he will actually hit the right target at the right time. With that logic, the biplane ending probably felt correct. After all, this is a clear Chekhov's gun. The biplane is established immediately, and then throughout the entire rest of the film, he drags it on the back of his motorhome, continuing to reiterate and establish it so it would finally pay off in the original climax. Even though this has been building since the very first time we saw the character, audiences were simply not prepared to accept the sight of him in that rickety old plane, keeping up with fighter jets and alien shuttles. It is simply too absurd. And I personally agree, it looks awful. Seeing Randy Quaid in his aviator hat and goggles, it's just completely ridiculous, and they should have known it didn't work while they were filming it. Now is a very good time to talk about tone and how Independence Day handles it. The first act of the film balances a looming, mounting suspense about the aliens' arrival with introducing the characters, mixing the characters' fear and anxiety about the alien presence with humour. Smith and Goldblum are charismatic and funny in their early scenes, but once the ticking clock of the countdown is established, the humour is more pocketed with minor characters, many of whom die in the initial attack. There's a real sense of horror and scale to the annihilation and the subsequent aftermath, and Independence Day is a darker movie than is sometimes thought of. It's a movie where millions of people die violent deaths, made palatable by a happy ending. The second act of the film is humanity brought to the depths of despair, all attempts to fight back are met with failure and more loss. That heaviness is released as we move into the third act, as David's virus sees some hope at last of defeating the alien menace, and there's a sense of catharsis about it that allows the film to become more light-hearted and jubilant. But the movie doesn't and shouldn't become an out-and-out comedy, but that's exactly what happens if Russell flies in with his biplane. It is, after all, an image inspired by a comedy, directly referencing Slim Pickens riding the bomb at the end of Doctor Strangelove, but that's precisely the reason why it doesn't work. It steps the movie over that thin, precarious line of becoming a parody of itself, especially considering the movie was racing to beat Tim Burton's spoof Mars Attacks into cinemas that year. And this is why the arc in the reshot version works, mixing comedy and pathos in a way that feels much more natural, and makes clear that it is a redemption arc having been validated by the alien attack. Having Russell appear out of nowhere makes him feel like a Deus Ex Machina just to save the day, and also makes him seem one-note, who begins and ends the movie as a drunk. By adding new inserts of Russell in the midst of battle, it gives him a reason to be there and a sense of purpose, but it also makes it far more satisfying when he comes in after Whitmore's last missile fails. We know what he's been through, and it's fitting that he's the one that takes the shit down. When his missile malfunctions, it adds another element of tension as the window to attack closes, something that was missing before, and all of this was added in the reshoot. The beat of him realising what he must do and his son on the ground listening to his final moments adds some much needed drama and weight to this crucial moment. Interestingly, in the original ending, Miguel does actually speak to Russell in his final moments, but he's held back in the theatrical version, presumably because the filmmakers thought this was unnecessary, especially as the revised version is so much longer due to all the added footage. All of these things reconfigures Russell's act into a heroic and selfless sacrifice, instead of simply just being suicidal. But then we're allowed some humour as he rides towards his destiny with that "Hello boys, I'm back!" being genuinely funny and triumphant. It's exactly the right cap for the character and the moment, and clearly the filmmakers thought so, because that was actually an ad-lib when they shot the original ending that they kept when they reshot it. Emmerich and Devlin screened the film a final time prior to release in Las Vegas with the new ending, and this time the results were even higher, getting a near perfect 98. It confirmed the reshoot was the right thing to do, and Independence Day would go on to be the biggest film of summer 1996, all because they stuck the landing. If there is a moral to this story, maybe it's that reshoots aren't always bad. I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.